A cave mouth, somewhere in what is now France, 40,000 years ago. Snow outside. Inside, a fire has burned down to embers, and beside it lies a stone smooth, fist-sized, pulled from the coals and wrapped in a scrap of hide. Someone presses it gently against the chest of a baby too small to have been born on time. The baby's breathing is a whisper. The stone is the only machine this family has. That stone is where our story begins. And it is where, in a very different form, our story will end. The surface question is simple enough. What did ancient humans do when a baby arrived too early? But the real question, the one that actually matters, is this. Did our ancestors even have the concept of too early? Did they understand fragility as something to fight for or something to accept? And if they fought, what tools does a species with no incubators, no antibiotics, no NICU monitors actually have? Here's the short answer, and it will surprise you. Ancient humans were not helpless. They had a technology for this one so old, so simple, and so effective that modern medicine eventually had to reinvent it. But the full story is stranger, sadder, and more human than that single fact suggests. Start with the basic biology, because it explains everything that follows. A human pregnancy is a gamble that runs on a clock nobody controls. Birth before that clock finishes its count produces an infant with underdeveloped lungs, thin skin, almost no body fat, and a body that cannot yet regulate its own temperature. In a modern hospital, that baby goes into a climate-controlled box within minutes. Ancient humans had no such box. What they had was warmth, closeness, and each other. Anthropologists who study small-scale societies, hunter-gatherer groups whose ways of life echo, however imperfectly, our deep past, describe a strategy now known as skin-to-skin contact, or kangaroo care. A caregiver holds the infant directly against bare skin, often for hours at a stretch, sometimes around the clock. Body heat transfers. Heart rhythms synchronize. It sounds almost too simple to be medicine. But here's the strange part. It works. Not as folklore, not as sentiment as physiology. And yet, we have to be careful here, because it's tempting to imagine every ancient mother as an instinctive expert nurse, calmly saving fragile lives with warmth and willpower. The reality resists that fairy tale. Premature birth in a world without medical intervention was, brutally often, unsurvivable. Infant mortality across most of human prehistory is estimated by researchers to have been staggeringly high, plausibly, a third or more of infants not surviving their first year, with the earliest and smallest most at risk of all. Warmth and closeness could support a baby whose lungs and organs were only slightly underdeveloped. They could not manufacture a windpipe wide enough to breathe, or lungs mature enough to inflate. So the honest answer is uncomfortable. Ancient humans practiced real, effective, low-technology care, and it still frequently was not enough. Care and grief lived side by side every single day. To make this concrete, consider Neanderthal burial sites, not because Neanderthals are premature infants themselves, obviously, but because these sites are some of the oldest direct windows we have into how ancient hominins treated their most vulnerable dead. At more than one Neanderthal site, archaeologists have recovered the remains of infants who died in their first days or weeks of life, buried with a deliberateness that implies grief, not disposal. Small bodies, positioned with apparent care, sometimes alongside modest grave goods. We cannot know from bones alone whether any specific one of these infants was born early. What we can know is this: even 100,000 years ago, an infant who did not survive was not simply discarded. Someone dug a hole. Someone chose a position for the tiny body. Someone marked, in the only language available to them, that this life had mattered. That's an inference. Not a certainty, but it's a powerful one. The first category of evidence is skeletal. Bioarchaeologists examine infant remains for markers of stress-thin, porous bone, or growth patterns consistent with a low birth weight. Context matters enormously here. An infant buried inside a settlement, close to hearths and the living, tells a different story than one discarded outside its boundaries. Location becomes a kind of testimony. The second category is the archaeology of the hearth itself. Across sites spanning tens of thousands of years, the material remains of ancient homes consistently center on fire. Fire wasn't only for cooking. It was climate control, and in a world before thermostats, staying near it was often the difference between a fragile infant's survival and its death. Every hearth we excavate is, in a sense, a fossilized incubator. The third category is comparative ethnography, the study of contemporary or recent hunter-gatherer and small-scale agricultural societies, used cautiously as a window onto practices that may echo deep patterns of human behavior. Researchers working with such communities have documented extended, near-constant skin contact between mothers and newborns, extended nursing on demand, and communal caregiving, where multiple adults, not just a birth mother, provide warmth and feeding support. This last point deserves its own weight. Premature infant survival, in many of these societies, is not a solo project. It's a group effort. The fourth category is material culture, the objects themselves. Swaddling wraps, soft leather pouches, woven slings, and warmed stones or heated sand bundled in hide all appear, in one form or another, across an extraordinary range of cultures and time periods. None of these are exotic inventions. They are the same idea, discovered again and again: trap heat, hold it close, don't let it escape. That's where the real discovery of this whole story lives, not in any single object, but in the sheer, repeated convergence on the same solution. Different continents, different millennia. Same answer. The fifth category is dietary. Milk is calibrated by evolution to the infant that produced the pregnancy. A mother's early milk, colostrum, is dense with immune protective compounds precisely when a fragile newborn needs them most. Ancient caregivers didn't understand immunology, but they understood, empirically, generation after generation, that a nursing infant fared better than one denied the breast. That knowledge didn't need a laboratory. It needed only attention, repeated across enough winters to become certain. Now, for the piece of evidence historians genuinely argue about, how ancient societies treated visibly weak or severely premature infants when survival looked unlikely from the start. Some historical and ethnographic accounts describe difficult decisions, including, in certain documented cultures and periods, the abandonment or non-rearing of infants judged unlikely to survive, particularly in times of famine or extreme scarcity. One interpretation holds that these practices reflect a pragmatic, even loving calculus in a world with no medicine. Prolonging a doomed infant's suffering and depleting resources a family needed to keep other children alive could be its own form of terrible mercy. The opposing interpretation, held by other scholars, cautions against reading modern triage logic backward onto ancient minds we cannot interview, and warns that some accounts may reflect outsider bias, incomplete records, or the assumptions of later observers rather than the internal reasoning of the people who lived it. Both readings deserve respect. The truth is very likely uncomfortable, situational, and impossible to flatten into a single universal rule. Scarcity does not produce simple villains or simple heroes. It produces impossible choices. Here is where the story shifts, and the shift itself is a kind of reveal. Everything so far has come from bones, hearths, and inference indirect evidence, pieced together like a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. But once humans begin to write, the fog lifts and premature infants step, briefly, directly into the historical record. In ancient Greece, the physician Cyrannus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century, described in detail how to judge whether a newborn was worth rearing, assessing cry, movement, and vigor, and offered guidance for warming and swaddling weak infants. In ancient Egypt, medical papyri contain remedies and rituals aimed at strengthening frail newborns. These are not archaeological guesses anymore. These are people writing down, in their own words, that fragile infants existed, and that care for them was a subject worth their ink. That's the bridge, from silence to voice, from what we infer to what we can finally read. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. In the late 19th century, decades before hospital incubators became standard, a French physician built a heated box for premature infants modeled explicitly on a poultry incubator, because nothing more sophisticated existed yet. Around the same period, a doctor in Paris began publicly exhibiting premature infants in incubators at fairs and expositions, precisely to prove that warmth alone could save babies doctors had otherwise written off. In other words, humanity's most advanced neonatal technology, for its first true generation, was still just an engineered version of that stone by the fire. Modern neonatology didn't replace ancient wisdom, it industrialized it. It's worth pausing here to reject a tempting but false picture, the idea of ancient people as one uniform mass, all making the same choices, all holding the same beliefs about fragile life. They didn't. A forager band in a resource-rich river valley and a small agricultural community surviving a famine year were not living the same moral universe, even if they existed in the same century. Think of it this way. Imagine judging all of modern humanity's attitude toward premature birth using only footage from one hospital in one country during one budget crisis. You'd get a distorted, partial picture true in that room, false as a universal claim. Ancient societies deserve the same caution. Culture, climate, scarcity, and individual temperament shaped these decisions as much as they do today. Two dimensions rarely make it into this story. The first is maternal survival itself. Premature birth was, and remains, disproportionately linked to complications for the mother, meaning that in many ancient contexts, the person best equipped to provide the skin-to-skin warmth a fragile infant needed most was also the person most likely to be gravely weakened, or lost, in the same event. Infant care and maternal recovery were never separate stories. They were one crisis, unfolding simultaneously. The second overlooked dimension is emotional labor distributed beyond the mother. In many documented small-scale societies, grandmothers, aunts, and even unrelated women within a group take on substantial infant care, a pattern some researchers call the grandmother effect, in which older female relatives measurably improve child survival odds. A fragile newborn's odds, in other words, may have depended less on any one person's heroism and more on how many hands a community was willing to offer. Now layer in the sheer physical reality of ancient daily life. There was no maternity leave. A caregiver holding a fragile infant against her chest for hour after hour still needed to eat, gather, process food, care for other children, and often travel. Mobility itself, foraging groups that moved with seasons and game placed brutal limits on how long any single strategy could be sustained. This is why communal caregiving wasn't a nicety. It was survival math. One person cannot hold a fragile life against their skin for 18 straight hours and keep a family fed. A group can. That single fact may have shaped kinship bonds and social structures more than we usually credit. And here's where the story loops back to something you can find in any hospital on Earth right now. Kangaroo care skin-to-skin contact for premature infants is not a historical curiosity revived for a documentary. It is standard, evidence-based practice in modern neonatal units today, recommended precisely because it stabilizes an infant's heart rate, breathing, and body temperature. The World Health Organization actively promotes it, especially in settings where incubators are scarce or unavailable. We didn't discard the ancient method when we built machines. We still do this today sometimes instead of the machine, sometimes right alongside it, wired with monitors. but skin against skin all the same. Which raises a bigger question than any single technique. Why does this problem, how to protect a life that arrived before it was ready, keep summoning the same human response across 100,000 years and every conceivable culture? Maybe because it forces a question every generation has to answer for itself. What do we owe a life that cannot yet advocate for itself? Every era answers a little differently, but every era, it seems, has to answer. So how did ancient humans treat premature babies? With warmth, closeness, and communal effort wherever survival looked possible. With painful, situational, and sometimes unbearable choices wherever it did not. And, either way, with a level of attentiveness and grief that proves fragility was never treated as meaningless. In one sentence, ancient humans met the era's harshest medical problem with humanity's oldest technology, each other. Picture that stone again, pulled from the embers, wrapped in hide, pressed against a chest too small and too new for this cold world. It could not manufacture a lung. It could not guarantee a morning. But it was proof that someone, in the dark, had decided this life was worth the effort of trying. That is the larger truth hiding inside every incubator, every hospital blanket, every parent's bare chest against a newborn's skin tonight. Care has never really been about having the perfect tool. It has always been about refusing to let go first. The stone cooled hours ago. The fire is long since ash. But somewhere tonight, in a hospital that would be unrecognizable to that cave, someone is still doing the very same thing, holding on, and hoping the warmth is enough.